Title: The CIA document that predicted Wokism format. Long-form video analysis script target: 4,200 to 4,800 words / 13 to 15 minutes at 2x speed. In U.S. intraneural. Introduction: midnight to 1 o'clock, 320 words. In December 1985, an intelligence analyst inside the Central Intelligence Agency sat down to write a report. It was classified confidential. It ran 22 pages, and it contained something unusual for an intelligence document: frank celebration. The report was called France, Defection of the Leftist Intellectuals. Its purpose was to track what the CIA saw as a seismic shift in French intellectual life. Over the course of the 1970s and early 1980s, France's leftist thinkers, writers, philosophers, academics, had abandoned the political tradition they had dominated for decades. They walked away from an honest look at who holds power. They walked away from class-based politics, and they did so with spectacular public conviction, writing bestsellers that attacked their own former beliefs. The CIA watched this unfold, and the agency was pleased. This wasn't just a cultural observation. The document's core thesis is stated with remarkable bluntness. This intellectual shift, the document says, will make it difficult for anyone to mobilize significant intellectual opposition to U.S. policies. Not inconvenient for leftist intellectuals, bad for anyone trying to oppose American power. The CIA saw the defection of France's left intelligentsia as a strategic victory for the United States. That was 1985. 40 years later, we are living through a strikingly similar dynamic. The language is different. The labels are different, but the pattern is the same. A generation of people who consider themselves progressive has drifted away from material politics, from questions of wages, housing, healthcare, from the basic fact that the system is rigged against working people, and into an entirely different arena: identity, language, culture war, purity testing. The left today is consuming itself with internal battles, while the people who actually hold power, the ones who decide whether you can afford rent, whether your job still exists next year, whether your kids will breathe clean air, operate with virtually no organized opposition from those who claim to represent change. This is not an accident, and it is not new. The 1985 CIA document provides the blueprint. This video is about that document, about what it reveals, and about the uncomfortable parallel between the French intellectual defection of the 1980s and the cultural battles consuming the left today. Context: 1 to 3 o'clock, 640 words. To understand what the CIA was celebrating, you need to understand what France's leftist intellectual tradition actually meant. France has a long and distinct history of intellectuals as public political actors. This tradition goes back to the Dreyfus Affair in the 1890s, when Émile Zola published Jacques, an open letter defending a Jewish army officer falsely convicted of treason. Zola was a novelist, not a politician, but he used his platform to intervene in a matter of national injustice. That act essentially invented the modern concept of the public intellectual. The tradition continued through the 20th century. Jean-Paul Sartre was the dominant figure. Sartre was a philosopher, playwright, and novelist who was also a committed Marxist, or at least a fellow traveler. He refused the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1964 because he did not want to be co-opted by establishment institutions. He participated in protests, signed manifestos, and used his enormous cultural influence to push French politics leftward. When Sartre spoke, people listened, and Sartre was consistently, vocally critical of American foreign policy, the war in Vietnam, the support for dictatorships, the entire architecture of post-war U.S. power. This was not a French position. In post-war France, the left dominated intellectual life. The French Communist Party, the PCF, was a major political force. It commanded around a quarter of the national vote. It had deep roots in labor unions, in working-class communities, in the resistance tradition from World War II. Being an intellectual in France meant, in many circles, being on the left. Being against American power was taken as a circumstantial evidence of an adequate education. To use the CIA's own rueful phrasing, anti-Americanism was the default. But by the 1970s, this consensus was cracking. Several things happened at once. First, the student protest of May 1968 shook France to its core. Millions of workers joined students in a general strike. The country virtually shut down. President Charles de Gaulle briefly fled the country. It was the closest France had come to a revolutionary situation since the Paris Commune of 1871. But the traditional left, the Communist Party, the unions, did not know what to do with this spontaneous uprising. They hesitated. They tried to control it. In the end, the movement fizzled. De Gaulle called elections and won. And a generation of young leftists felt betrayed by the very institutions they had looked to for leadership. Second, the Soviet Union's true nature became harder to ignore. Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, which exposed the vast Soviet prison camp system in devastating detail, was published in French in 1975. It hit the French intellectual scene like a bomb. Many French leftists had maintained some sympathy for the Soviet project, or at least had avoided criticizing it directly. Solzhenitsyn made that impossible. If you were a Marxist, you had to reckon with what Marxism had produced in practice. Third, the economy was changing. The post-war boom was ending. Unemployment was rising. The certainties of the old left, the working class as the agent of history, the inevitability of socialism, the moral clarity of anti-imperialism, no longer seemed so certain. This was the opening, and into it stepped a new generation of intellectuals who had been formed on the left, but were now ready to burn it down. The Defection, 3 to 6 o'clock, 960 words. The CIA document identifies the key actors by name. Two figures stand out: André Glucksmann and Bernard-Henri Lévy. Both men came from the left. Glucksmann had been a Maoist, one of the ultra-radicals who believed even the Communist Party was not revolutionary enough. Lévy had been a student activist. Both were shaped by the failure of 1968 and by the revelations of the Gulag, and both underwent a dramatic public transformation that would make them international celebrities. In 1977, Lévy published a book called Barbarism with a Human Face. It was a full-throated attack on the entire Marxist tradition. Lévy argued, and the CIA document quotes this directly, that all Marxist thought is ultimately totalitarian. Not some Marxist thought, not Stalin's version of Marxism. The entire tradition, from Marx onward, was inherently oppressive. The implication was clear. Any politics based on class struggle, any attempt to understand the world through the lens of who holds economic power, was a road to the Gulag. Glucksmann went even further. In books like The Cook and the Cannibal and The Master Thinkers, he traced a direct line from Marx and Hegel to the Soviet camps. The very structure of Marxist thought, he argued, led to totalitarianism. To think in terms of class was already to think in terms of control. These arguments were not just academic. They were media events. Lévy in particular was a born showman, handsome, well-connected, always camera-ready. He appeared on television talk shows, wrote columns in major newspapers like Le Monde and Le Figaro, and positioned himself as the face of a new intellectual movement that the French press dubbed the Nouveaux Philosophes, the new philosophers. The timing mattered. France was just emerging from the shadow of 1968, still trying to understand what that explosion meant. And here were these young, passionate intellectuals offering a clean break. You did not have to defend the old left. You did not have to apologize for Stalin. You could reject the whole thing and start fresh. For a generation of French readers and viewers who were tired of the ideological battles of their parents, this was liberating. It was also a trap, because rejecting the entire left tradition meant you were left with nothing but the liberal status quo. But that realization would come later. The CIA document describes their motivation with reasonable accuracy. It says they were driven by two developments. First, the failure of the traditional left during 1968, which tore the scales from their eyes. And second, the impact of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which accelerated their critique of the Soviet Union. But the document understates something important. The new philosophers did not merely criticize the Soviet Union. They used anti-Sovietism as a weapon against all leftist politics. To oppose American foreign policy, they implied, was to be complicit with the Gulag. To care about economic inequality was to be blind to the horrors of communism. Any critique of capitalism was, by extension, a defense of totalitarianism. This was a devastating rhetorical move. It shifted the entire terms of debate. Before the new philosophers, you could criticize American power and still be taken seriously in French intellectual circles. After them, doing so required you to first prove you were not a Stalinist. The burden of proof had been flipped. The French press loved it. The new philosophers were covered like rock stars. Their books were bestsellers. They appeared on the cover of magazines. They were young, they were passionate, they were attacking the old orthodoxies, and they were ex-leftists themselves, which gave them credibility. You couldn't dismiss them as right-wing propagandists. They had been there. They had believed. They had seen the light. And the effect on French intellectual life was devastating. The CIA document quotes the French sociologist Alain Taran, who described it as a kind of death. There is a lethargy about intellectual life in this country that is quite spectacular. Never before have I known such silence, such emptiness. It's like a family in which someone has died. By the mid-1980s, the French Communist Party was intellectually hollowed out. The CIA document states, and this is worth quoting in full, the worst kept secret in PCF circles for the past decade was that virtually every communist intellectual of any stature had either died or defected from the party. Not some, not most. Every communist intellectual of any stature. The left had been decapitated, and the new philosophers provided the model. You didn't need to be a right-winger to attack the left. You could be a former leftist. You could be more passionate, more credible, more effective than any conservative critic, and the media would love you for it. This pattern is going to come up again. CIA's response, 6 to 9 o'clock, 960 words. Now we get to the document itself. Because the CIA was not merely observing this transformation, the agency was tracking it in granular detail, analyzing its implications for American power, and explicitly celebrating the outcome. The document, remember, is an intelligence research paper from the Directorate of Intelligence, Office of European Analysis. It is not a policy memo. It is not a plan for covert action. It is an assessment. And what it assesses is that the United States is winning. The key passage comes early in the paper. Let me quote it exactly. There is a new climate of intellectual opinion in France, a spirit of anti-Marxism and anti-Sovietism that will make it difficult for anyone to mobilize significant intellectual opposition to U.S. policies. Read that sentence again. The CIA is saying that the intellectual climate in France has shifted so thoroughly that it is now hard to find credible opposition to American foreign policy. Not unpopular, not ineffective, difficult for anyone to mobilize significant intellectual opposition. The agency treats this as a strategic asset. The document goes on. Anti-Sovietism, in fact, has become the touchstone of legitimacy in leftist circles, weakening the traditional anti-Americanism of the leftist intellectuals. Anti-Sovietism is now the marker of seriousness. To be taken seriously as a leftist, you must first denounce the Soviet Union. And since the Soviet Union was the primary ideological enemy of the United States, this meant leftists were effectively policing themselves on America's behalf. They were spending their energy attacking the enemy of their enemy, rather than opposing American power. The document is remarkably specific about what this means in practice. It notes that the new intellectual climate will almost certainly make it very difficult for anyone to mobilize significant intellectual opposition among elite to U.S. policies in Central America, for example. Central America in the 1980s. Reagan was funding the Contras in Nicaragua, supporting death squads in El Salvador, overthrowing governments in Guatemala. This was the hot front of American intervention, and the CIA's own document acknowledges that the success of this policy depended in part on whether French intellectuals would oppose it. Thanks to the new philosophers, they would not. The document also tracks the public opinion shift. By 1985, polls showed 43% of French people had a favorable opinion of the United States, compared to just 9% favorable for the Soviet Union. That is not a close contest. But more importantly, the document notes a cultural shift. Finding virtues in America, even identifying good things about U.S. government policies, is looked upon as an indication of discerning judgment. The very act of praising America had become a mark of sophistication. Think about what the document is describing. A generation earlier, being anti-American was proof you were educated. Now, being pro-American was proof you were discerning. The polarity had reversed, and the CIA knew exactly why. This is the part of the document that is hardest to read without feeling something. The CIA is not describing a neutral cultural shift. It is describing a victory. The people who had opposed American power, who had spoken out against the war in Vietnam, who had marched against nuclear weapons, who had supported liberation movements around the world, had been silenced, marginalized, or converted. And the agency that had spent decades fighting those people was now writing a report that said, essentially, mission accomplished. The document is dated December 1985. It was declassified and released in May 2011. It sat in the archives for 26 years before the public could read what the CIA had written about the intellectual disarmament of the French left. But here's the thing. The pattern did not stop in 1985. It did not stop in France. It spread. Modern parallels. 9 to 12 o'clock. 960 words. Now we have to talk about the present. And I want to be careful here, because this is the part that people will resist. So let me state the argument as clearly as I can. The same dynamic that the CIA documented in 1980s France is playing out today in the English-speaking world, particularly in the United States, Britain, and Canada. The labels are different. The specific issues are different. But the underlying pattern is identical. In the 1980s, leftist intellectuals abandoned class politics for anti-Sovietism. They spent their energy attacking the Soviet Union, proving their anti-communist credentials, and positioning themselves as sophisticated critics of the left. The result was that meaningful opposition to American power collapsed. Today, a generation of people who consider themselves progressive has abandoned class politics for a different arena. The focus has shifted from material conditions, wages, housing, healthcare, labor rights, the basic fact that the system is rigged against working people, to questions of identity, language, representation, and culture war. Now, let me be clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that questions of identity and representation are unimportant. They are not. Discrimination based on race, gender, sexuality, and other factors is real and damaging. Fighting that discrimination is a legitimate part of any decent politics. What I am saying is that when identity politics becomes the entirety of progressive politics, when it replaces rather than complements material analysis, it performs exactly the same function that anti-Sovietism performed in the 1980s. It redirects energy away from the people who actually hold power. It fragments the working class into competing identity groups, and it makes the left unpalatable to large numbers of everyday people who might otherwise support material change. Look at what has happened to the left in the United States over the past decade. The energy that could have gone into building working class organizations, fighting for universal healthcare, defending labor unions, or challenging the power of corporations has instead gone into battles over pronouns, critical race theory, cancel culture, and ideological purity tests. Every cultural institution, universities, media companies, nonprofits, even the Democratic Party, now has an elaborate vocabulary for identifying and punishing ideological deviation. The language shifts constantly. What was acceptable last year is a microaggression this year. Who was a progressive ally last month is now canceled this month. This is the new philosopher's playbook. You police the left for ideological purity. You find heresy everywhere. You establish yourself as a sophisticated critic of the left's failures. And the media, the same media that spent decades dismissing the left as unserious, suddenly finds you fascinating. They put you on television. They publish your think pieces. You become a star by attacking your own. There is a deeper structural reason this happens. The media and cultural institutions are themselves part of the system. They need the left to be weak. Not so weak that there is no opposition at all, but weak enough that the opposition is not dangerous. A left that fights about pronouns is not a left that organizes strikes. A left that spends its energy policing language in faculty lounges is not a left that shuts down ports or occupies factories. The system can absorb and even encourage the first kind of left. The second kind of left is a genuine threat. The celebrity dissidents of today write bestsellers about how progressive politics has lost its way. They appear on podcasts. They are invited to testify before Congress. They are treated as brave truth tellers because they are saying what the establishment has wanted to hear all along. that the left is dangerous, irrational, and needs to be contained. Meanwhile, what happens to the working class? What happens to the people who cannot afford rent, who are drowning in medical debt, who work 2 jobs and still cannot get ahead? They watch the left debate whether a particular word is offensive. They watch activists argue about who is allowed to speak at a university. They watch people who claim to represent them spend their energy on issues that have nothing to do with their daily struggle to survive. And they walk away. They conclude that the left has nothing to offer them. They become cynical about politics entirely. Or worse, they turn to the right, which at least talks about their material problems, even if the solutions it offers are lies that will make their lives worse. This is the tragedy of modern progressivism. The people who most need material change, working people, poor people, people who are struggling to survive in a system rigged against them, are being abandoned by the very people who claim to fight for them. And the abandonment happens in the name of a politics that is supposedly more advanced, more sophisticated, more pure than the old class-based left. Sound familiar? It should. It is exactly what happened in France. The new philosophers did not just abandon the working class. They actively attacked the idea that class analysis had any value at all. They dismissed the very concept of structural economic critique as inherently totalitarian. And the CIA celebrated. There is another parallel worth noting. The new philosophers succeeded in part because they operated within a media ecosystem that amplified them. France in the 1970s and 1980s saw the rise of new television channels, new magazines, new formats for intellectual celebrity. Lévy and Glucksmann were products of this ecosystem as much as they were drivers of it. Today, the same pattern plays out through social media algorithms, online publications, and the constant churn of hot takes. The platforms reward conflict. They reward outrage. They reward calling out heresy within your own camp. A thoughtful analysis of class structure gets fewer clicks than a viral thread about someone's offensive tweet. The incentives of the medium amplify the worst tendencies of the movement. Today's culture war left does not need the CIA to celebrate it. The effect is the same whether the CIA is involved or not. The function of both movements, the new philosophers then, the identity-focused left now, is the same. To defund class-based politics, to fragment the people who might challenge the holders of power, and to ensure that no meaningful opposition to the existing order can be organized. Counterargument, 12 to 1330, for 80 words. Now I need to address something important. There is a genuine objection to what I have just argued. It goes like this. The activists and intellectuals driving today's identity-focused politics are not doing it to serve American empire. They are not CIA assets. They genuinely believe in their cause. They are fighting against real discrimination and real harm. Comparing them to the new philosophers is unfair. I want to take that objection seriously because there is truth in it. The vast majority of people involved in modern progressive activism are sincere. They have seen injustice. They want to make the world better. They are not secret agents or conscious tools of the establishment. Their beliefs are real, and their motivations are genuine. But here's the problem. Intent does not determine effect. You can be completely sincere in your beliefs and still produce outcomes that serve the interests of the powerful. You can fight for what you think is right and still weaken the forces that could actually challenge the system rigged against working people. Good intentions do not guarantee good results. The new philosophers were also sincere. Glucksmann and Lévy genuinely believed they were fighting totalitarianism. They genuinely believed Marxism was a danger to freedom. Their motivations were not cynical. They were not paid by the CIA. They were following their convictions wherever they led. And those convictions led them to become the most effective critics of the left, to make it harder for anyone to oppose American power, to help create a climate in which the only acceptable politics was the politics of the status quo. The CIA noticed. The CIA celebrated. But the CIA did not create them. The same is true today. People who police the left for ideological purity, who elevate culture war over material struggle, who fragment the working class along identity lines, they are not agents of the establishment. Most of them are acting in good faith. But the effect of their actions is the same as if they were. The left is weaker. The working class is more divided. The people who hold real power face less opposition. This is what Marxists call objective analysis. You look at what a movement actually does, not what it says it does, not what its members believe they are doing, and you assess the real-world consequences. A movement that claims to be progressive but spends its energy on culture war rather than material change is objectively undermining the left, regardless of the subjective intentions of its members. Conclusion, 1330 to 1500 hours, for 80 words. So let me bring this to a close. In December 1985, a CIA analyst sat down and wrote a report about how French intellectuals had abandoned the left. The report is a remarkable document, not because it reveals covert operations or secret plots, but because it shows, with unusual clarity, how the establishment thinks about intellectual life. The CIA understood that ideas matter. The agency understood that if you can shift the intellectual climate, you can achieve your political goals without firing a shot. And the agency understood that the most effective way to destroy the left was not to attack it from the outside, but to encourage its internal self-destruction. The new philosophers did the work for them. Today's culture warriors are doing the work for the same system, whether they realize it or not. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is pattern recognition. The same structural dynamic has played out twice in 40 years. First in France, with anti-Sovietism replacing class politics. Then in the English-speaking world, with identity politics replacing class politics. In both cases, the result is the same. The people who might challenge the people in power turn on each other instead. The working class gets abandoned. The system continues. What is the alternative? It starts with recognizing the pattern. It starts with understanding that a politics that focuses on culture war at the expense of material conditions is not a politics of change. It is a politics of distraction. It is a politics that serves the people who benefit from the current arrangement, no matter what its practitioners intend. Real change requires a different approach. It requires focusing on what unites everyday people rather than what divides them. It requires building organizations that can actually improve people's lives, labor unions, tenant associations, mutual aid networks, political parties that answer to working people. It requires talking about the things that matter most: the cost of housing, the price of healthcare, the security of a job, the dignity of a paycheck, the future your children will inherit. These are not left issues or right issues. These are human issues. And they are the issues that the current system cannot solve, because the current system is designed to benefit the people at the top at the expense of everyone else. The CIA wrote its report 40 years ago. The pattern it described is still playing out. But patterns can be recognized. And once you see the pattern, you have a choice. You can keep fighting the battles that the establishment wants you to fight, the culture wars, the purity tests, the internal destruction of the left. Or you can step back, look at the big picture, and start building something that actually works for everyday people. The choice is yours, and it matters more than you know. Think about what the world could look like if the energy currently spent on internal leftist battles were redirected toward building real power for everyday people. Imagine what could be accomplished if the people who care about justice spent their time organizing workers, fighting for affordable housing, building tenant unions, and pushing for universal healthcare, instead of arguing about who said the wrong thing on Twitter. That world is possible, but it will not arrive by accident. It requires seeing the pattern, understanding what the CIA document reveals about how intellectual movements can be hollowed out from within, and making a conscious choice to focus on what actually changes lives. Look at the document one more time. It is sitting in the CIA archives, declassified, available for anyone to read. A cold piece of intelligence analysis from 40 years ago. It predicted that a left that abandoned material analysis would be a left that could not threaten the people who hold power. That prediction came true in France. It is coming true again today. The question is whether we will let it keep coming true. End.